So today's topic, we are going to be talking about the nature gap, racial and economic disparities in the outdoors. And we have with us today Sahir Doshi, who's with the Center for American Progress. Thank you, Sahir. And Jessica, I hope I get this right, Godinez from the Hispanic Access Foundation. So these two organizations have been working on this study. They did a presentation to AMC back in February, and I did not register in time and was not able to see it. I heard it was great, and I saw some clips from it and watched most of it, but I was very grateful when I reached out to ask folks if they would come back and do another one. They said they would. So hopefully you got a chance to read their bios. And just a quick note about Main Lakes, we have never really done much or considered environmental justice in our work, but I'm really excited that last summer we had a great discussion among our board members and we did create an environmental justice committee and looking at the crossroads of lake conservation and environmental justice in Maine. And so there's some really exciting work to be done, and I for one am really happy that we've added this lens to our work at Main Lakes. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So thank you again, Jessica and Sahir, for being here, and I will pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm just gonna share my screen as well so that folks can see the presentation that we have. Yeah, so thank you again to Main Lakes and everyone who's attending this for your interest in this subject and your advocacy. So I'm from the Center for American Progress's Public Lands Program, and similar to Main Lakes, we care very much about both educating and promoting legislative solutions that can help to protect nature and the resilience that it provides us in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of social-economic benefits to the communities that live around it. And together with Hispanic Access and Conservation Science partners, we recently, which is to say last year, conducted a study on the inequitable distribution of access to nature on the basis of race and economic status. So we've termed this the nature gap because I think that many folks intuitively or through their lived experience or through their communications with others, if you live in this country, you probably do have a sense that nature is not equitably distributed and access to nature is also not equitably distributed. So we just wanted to see if we could put numbers to that hunch that so many of us have, or that experience that so many of us have lived through, that certain folks, especially those who belong to certain racial and economic groups in this country that face a whole lot of other systemic problems in this country and injustices, are also facing that in terms of how decisions are being made as to what natural resources to conserve and what natural resources to destroy. So our analysis looked at human modification of land, and then it looked at demographics of the census tracts on which that modification had occurred. And we plotted those together to find that across the country, there is a very strong correlation between those areas that have had excessive destruction of nature due to everything from industry to energy-related development, urban infrastructure development, suburban sprawl, agriculture, and habitat fragmentation, and those census tracts where neighborhoods have a larger proportion of people of color or a larger proportion of people who are of low income. So the kind of main finding we had was that nationwide, if you look at it at a state level, in every state except DC and New Mexico, you find that if you live in a neighborhood that is more disproportionately non-white compared to the average of the state, you are more likely to also be living in a place that is deprived of access to nearby nature. So nationally, the figure is a 3 times difference between largely white communities and then largely non-white communities. I'm just gonna hover on this for a second for folks to just take in all the different numbers that we have here. And once again, this holds true for every state in the Union except for the New Mexico and the territory of DC. And then the same holds true again for income. So low income communities are more likely to be nature deprived. Again, when we use the term nature deprived, we mean that in the immediate vicinity of a community, the land and the water resources are disproportionately affected by human modification over the past few decades. So there again, you find that not only is being in a low income community something that correlates very highly with being in a nature deprived area, but being in a low income and largely non-white community, especially so. And then one of the findings that most surprised us that we did not expect, that was not part of that initial hunch, was that families with children are more likely to be in areas that are nature deprived. So if your community has a large proportion of kids, your community is also likely to not have nature around. And again, since nature deprivation means we're talking about areas that are mostly concrete, that don't have playgrounds, that don't have like natural parks and other such facilities for kids to get all the benefits of nature that my co-presenter Jessica will be talking about later. This is adding to kind of the generational inequities that people are facing in the country. This is again a little overview. We'll definitely drop a link into the chat box where you can take a look at all these statistics in more detail, but those areas in red are what we're calling nature gap hotspots. That's anywhere in the country that is, compared to its state, more like more heavily non-white or more heavily low income, and at the same time has been more depleted in terms of its natural resilience over the past many decades. And again, that holds true for all states. I pulled out Maine just because, of course, that's of specific interest here. And it's 84% of communities of color versus 26% of mostly white communities in Maine. Obviously, Maine's demographics mean that those statistics are rather extreme, but across the Northeast, we find that this is actually the region of the country that has the most extreme race-based nature gap. And again, for income, again, middle income neighborhoods in Maine, you have 43% that are nature deprived, whereas for low income neighborhoods, it's 72%. That's just a closer map of the Northeast, so folks can get a sense. Of course, many of these are concentrated in areas with largely urban populations, and that is one reason why we're thinking increasingly about how to have more natural resilience within cities. But there are also areas that are suburban, areas that are rural, that have low-income communities or non-white communities, and that are nature deprived. And the question then that some folks come to is, why is there a nature gap? Is this because folks are choosing to live in a certain kind of neighborhood? Is it because like the community is causing the nature deprivation? And the answer to those things is, generally speaking, no. The nature gap is part of many complex issues in the country. And of course, racism and the economic system in the country are not something that can simply be corrected by those of us working in nature conservation alone. But there are many specific areas within the development of our public land system, within the development of our priorities as a country, trying to conserve our natural resilience, that map out onto some of the injustices that occur in our economic system and in the racial structure of the country as a whole. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So yeah, so of course, from the very inception of our public land system, many of the natural resources that the United States has both destroyed and conserved over years have been done without respecting the sovereignty of native tribes, without having respect for both initially in the land theft and forced migration that created a lot of these areas, and then in more recent years, in terms of the tribal consultation responsibilities and the tribal-led conservation responsibilities that natural resource agencies are supposed to be executing as partners in the government-to-government relationship that the US federal government maintains with tribes. And then, like in so many other cases, the patterns of economic and racial segregation, redlining, and of course, how investment decisions have been made over the past many decades also influence what a neighborhood that someone looks like is in terms of resilience, naturally speaking. And then we specifically talk about energy waste and infrastructure development because there's an increasing body of research that's showing with data that some of the decisions on where toxic pollution should be concentrated, some of the decisions as to what kind of neighborhoods are seen as expendable when it comes to climate resilience. Many of those map out, again, to neighborhoods where you have lots of folks who are people of color, lots of folks who are low income, lots of people who have immigrant backgrounds. And on the flip side of that, the decisions of what parts of nature to protect are not necessarily being made with an eye to making sure that those communities have that resilience. So that's obviously changing in recent years with this conservation around environmental justice, as Susan herself mentioned, but there is still a very long way to go to implement that in the public lands and freshwater conservation sphere, as well as in the oceans, even more so than there is maybe in the climate side. And finally, we do also have to recognize that there is an explicit history of barring Black people from parks and beaches that today continues, if not in literal legal policy, in terms of some of the barriers that folks face when they actually are able to access parks. Very tragically, this specific research that we did came at the same time that Ahmaud Arbery's death was in the news, and that Christian Cooper, who was a birder, was threatened by a dog walker in Central Park, one of those areas that's a natural oasis in a very congested city. And that just drove home to us the importance of this kind of work, that not only do folks need to have access to spaces to get outside, but those spaces also have to be safe and welcoming for people to access in economic terms, and in terms of physical safety, in terms of what the staff there looks like, in terms of so many things that I'm very happy to hand over to Jessica to talk about in more detail. So just to finish, a great sentence from Jessica's co-worker, Shana: nature loss was a choice, and choices can be unmade.
Thank you, Sahir, for that introduction and overview of the nature gap. So I'll pick off where Sahir left off, and I will quickly also share a few slides with you all. So very quickly, I just wanted to introduce Hispanic Access a little bit. So we are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., but working nationally. So we are spread out across the country with a mission of connecting Latinos with partners and opportunities to improve lives and create an equitable society. So our vision really is that one day, every Hispanic individual, but really broadly, every individual in America will enjoy good physical health and a healthy natural environment with a quality education, economic success, and civic engagement in their communities, with the sum of improving the future of America. So I work as the Conservation Program Associate, in which we try to achieve this mission and vision through addressing things like the nature gap and environmental justice, and breaking down some of those barriers that Sahir was talking about when it comes to accessing the outdoor for our communities. So to bring it back to the nature gap, Sahir talked a lot about what it is and why it's there, but to take it a step further, I want to talk a little bit about, so why does this matter? What does this mean, and how can we address it? What can we do to try to lessen the nature gap throughout the country? So first of all, why does it matter? Why does it matter that this exists? Well, the existence of the nature gap really means that low-income and marginalized communities miss out on some of the key benefits of nature that others experience, including the opportunity for a healthy lifestyle. So natural areas allow recreation that promotes active lifestyles. This is important during normal times, of course, but we saw this importance increase specifically during the time of the pandemic, where everyone's kind of forced inside or sticking to local parks and neighborhoods. When not enough Americans get the physical activity that they need every day, and again, especially during times of pandemic, being outdoors is really the safest way to get out of our homes and exercise. So another benefit is a reduction in pollution. So nature reduces pollution. And this is so incredibly important for a lot of different reasons, but especially for communities of color that are statistically more likely to suffer from respiratory diseases due to local pollution. Pollution reduction by way of nature should really be a top priority for public health, for everybody's well-being. To stick with the theme of health, mental health and lower stress levels is another benefit that nature provides. And there's been a lot of studies in the past few years, especially on how having access to nature and just being surrounded by nature and green space can actually go a long way in reducing stress and helping with, you know, other illnesses like depression and anxiety. Performance in school and academics. So studies have also shown that students see a big boost in school performance when they have access to nature. And we've even seen a lot of different types of learning involving nature and, you know, kind of approaching it more hybridly, where folks are able to learn outdoors. And we've been able to see how beneficial that has been for students in their development. And again, you know, to bring it back to students' mental health and things like that. And lastly, perhaps one of the biggest benefits that nature provides is protection from extreme heat, floods, and other natural events. So greenery provides protection from extreme heat and flooding, both of which we'll continue to see a lot of. You know, we've already started to see a lot of it in different parts of the country, but we'll continue to see this worsen over the years due to climate change. And, you know, through research like the Nature Gap, we've seen that communities of color are especially vulnerable to these changes and to these extreme conditions. So greenery really protects communities from these climate hazards while also simultaneously absorbing greenhouse gas emissions and being able to actually mitigate climate change. And again, you know, in the past year, we've really seen how the nature gap is even more acute in the age of the pandemic, and this loss of benefits has been exacerbated for many communities. What do we need? You know, we know what these benefits are and what we're missing out on. So I'll go over some of the policy recommendations outlined in the Nature Gap report, starting with needing more nature that is closer to home for everyone, that is managed inclusively and locally, and is, you know, as Sahir was mentioning, welcoming and accessible for all. You know, just having the space there is one thing, but being able to be a person of color in the outdoors and feel safe and welcome is another step, is another barrier that needs to be addressed as well. And all of this is especially true for communities that are near cities, communities of color, and low-income communities. We also need to look at improving our hiring and workplace practices so that staff and leadership really reflect the communities that they're serving. And that goes a long way in breaking down barriers of alienation or cultural barriers that tend to arise in the workplace. So just as an example, I did want to mention one of the other programs at Hispanic Access Foundation really tries to tackle this issue by having a workforce development program, which is pretty specific to federal land management agencies. So actually placing students of color in these positions that will ideally lead them to permanent full-time positions, which will, you know, over time really change the way that we look at federal land management agencies and their makeup. You know, a lot of the times, I think Sahir alluded to it as well, a lot of times the barrier is going to a national park and not having anybody that speaks your language, or not having anybody that looks like you, and or having folks that, you know, like a lot of times these uniforms look like police uniforms, which, you know, bring up a lot of trauma for different communities for other reasons as well. So really being able to change the way that workplaces look, especially when we're talking about jobs in conservation and the outdoors, will go a really long way in breaking down some of these barriers. We also want to prioritize community consultation and engagement. We want to see direct engagement and consultation with community members and focus really on elevating the voices of those that are most affected by the disparities that are caused by the nature gap. So community consultation and engagement is really important so that you know, the decisions are being made with the voices of those affected in mind. So we want to hear the needs of the people who are the most impacted and will continue to be the most impacted by things like climate change and some of these barriers that we're mentioning. And when it comes to public lands too, and when we're talking about, you know, access to public lands, we really need to see improved consultation with tribal nations and more opportunities for tribal co-management of lands. Internationally, Indigenous led conservation has resulted in a lot of positive outcomes for socioeconomic well-being, ecosystem health, and the fight against climate change through emissions reductions and better stewardship of carbon sinks. You know, to provide more specific examples, in countries such as Canada, Brazil, and Argentina, studies have found that lands under Indigenous management contain more biodiversity than similar areas under non-Indigenous management. So a lot of successful international efforts may offer models for the United States to better recognize and support Indigenous-led conversation, and make sure that these tribes and Indigenous groups are not only a part of the conversation, but important decision makers when it comes to how these lands are managed. And lastly, but perhaps one of the most important recommendations brought forth by the report is an emphasis on bolstering education and outreach programs. So education alone will go a long way in getting the community not only involved and engaged in things like outdoor recreation, which we've seen have a lot of mental health benefits and health benefits in general, but ultimately being able to provide education for all communities, both communities of color, and getting more engaged in conservation efforts, but also through webinars like this, where we can kind of talk about really talk about what these barriers are, again, why they exist and what we can do to break them down. Ultimately, when we're talking about environmental justice, it has to start with education, and it has to start with understanding what we know and understanding what we don't know, and being able to take all of that information to put something together, collaborate together in a way that really breaks down these barriers and can help address the nature gap in a lot of different ways. So to provide another example from some of the work that we do is our annual initiative called Latino Conservation Week, which happens the third week in July every year. But that week is a focus on engaging Latino communities and other marginalized communities and outdoor recreation opportunities. So really providing opportunities for folks to get out, visit national parks free of cost, and be able to get folks out there without them having to worry about some of these barriers, providing interpretation so folks feel comfortable and welcome in these spaces as well. But they range from anything from outdoor recreation to, again, some more educational programming or direct stewardship help, even talking about getting engaged in policy efforts. So really any of that falls under the week. And I think that weeks like that are a great example for how we can really prioritize addressing these barriers and breaking them down, and getting communities involved in their own communities and in their own efforts as well. And so in the theme of learning and being able to share a little bit more resources for everybody to learn from, there are a few reports and toolkits in our resource gallery that I'd love to share with you all, including the report itself, which I did link in the chat. You all are all welcome to read it on the website or download it and share as you would like. Every year, Hispanic Access also releases a conservation policy toolkit that addresses a lot of these specific areas in which we want to address policy specifically. So that includes breakdowns on things mentioned like extreme heat and climate change, and how Latino communities are directly affected by that. So it's a big collection of data and research showing what the impact is on Latino communities for all of these different areas, and being able to provide some recommendations for how we can address those. And then lastly, last year we released our Nuestro Océano y la Costa, Latino Connections to the Ocean and Coast white paper, which is similar to the policy toolkit, in which it explores these different heritage and cultural connections that we have to oceans and coasts and coastal sites, and really talking through what those connections are, what the impacts of climate change and other natural occurrences are on our communities, and again, how to address those. So those are all available on our website, and I'll make sure to send the link in the chat for you all too, if you're interested in looking at some of these other toolkits and learning a little bit more. And then again, I'm happy to, I guess actually my contact information is right here. If you all have any other questions on this report, any of the other toolkits I mentioned, or learning a little bit more about some of our other initiatives like the Mano Project, our internship program, and Latino Conservation Week, which is coming up in July. So I think with that, we can stop there and answer any questions that you all have.
Hi again. Thanks so much. That was a lot of information, and it's really, really compelling, especially, in Maine. We are a green state. We do have a lot of green outdoor spaces, but to see those red spots, on your map and know that that disparity still exists here in a state with a lot of outdoor opportunities is really, I think, should be a message to all of us that we have some work to do in Maine for sure. So I'll go through a couple questions that have come in, and if anybody has anything, feel free to use the Q&A and type in your question, and we'll try to get to it. I have I'll start with a question from somebody in our audience. Oh, this is a good question because I had this question too. He says, I wonder if you have and could share any concrete examples of how primarily white communities, as many of the lakeside communities are here, how can we take steps to ensure that every person has access to health and recreation? Any thoughts on that for us?
Yeah, I guess I could answer that quickly with a lot of it comes down to contributing or helping break down these barriers that we talked about, right? And I think a lot of it comes to with recognizing that if you are a white identifying person, you can be an ally to this community, and you can be oftentimes, as we've seen, your voice is heard the loudest. So something that can be really helpful for white communities to do and trying to break down these disparities in health is really talking to your policy and lawmakers. Like that's absolutely something that we can all do regardless of what our race is, but really being able to use that power and privilege to advocate for other communities can go a really, really long way. Participating, if you have the capacity to organize events through your organization or through your work, being able to provide resources or opportunities that are, low cost or accessible to everybody, providing interpretation, things like that. Really being able to break down barriers to education primarily, again, I think is a good place to start, but also being able to use your voice as an ally and on behalf of communities of color is also really beneficial. And especially when we're talking about these policy pieces where a lot of times the work that needs to be done is on the policy level and is, needs to happen through a bill or whatever it may be. Supporting those initiatives and rallying behind them can go a really long way. So I know that's not a specific example, but I think things like that are really helpful, or even just reaching out to organizations that are super involved in these efforts and being able to collaborate or contribute or, provide support to the organizations and community members that are doing this work every day in your own local community is also great. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in that to look into who in your local neighborhood or organization or area is doing this work, and really reaching out and being able to support those.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think hopefully folks saw it in the introductory slideshow. There was a quick slide about the Maine Environmental Justice Committee. And so that was part of our, part of this talk was because of their interest in sponsoring this and some of the work that they've thought about. But, it has been challenging because of, a lot of our inequity here. It's hard to get those concrete. It's hard to find the concrete thing that you can do. We have a lot of lake associations. Primarily our members are lake associations, so there are small groups of homeowners around a lake that have gotten together, and they do amazing things for water quality and all kinds of great things, but it's just one audience for lakes. And so one of the things the our Environmental Justice Committee has looked at is expanding, and addressing the audience of people who don't own property on lake, and how to increase access and increase quality access of lakes. And so I think lake associations do have a role to play in sort of looking at their communities and thinking about that, and how to provide those opportunities for people in kind of the larger watershed who are looking for access to water.
Yeah, and I would add really quickly, Susan, before moving on to that, using your voice as an ally is powerful, but a lot of times one of the best things that you can do is elevate the voices of the communities of color that are doing this work. So if there isn't a specific way that you think is intentional and authentic to get involved, perhaps one of the most intentional, authentic things you can do is take a step back, right? Is give up your space for somebody else, for a different voice, for a community, you know, a person of color in this work who is trying to elevate this work. And really elevating the voices of underserved communities can be one of the biggest things you can do.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice. And I think just to let people know who are watching, the Wabanaki Alliance is the tribes in Maine have gotten together. You know, well, they haven't gotten together. They've always been together, but they have organized themselves and have a advocacy arm called the Wabanaki Alliance, and that they're a great group to elevate. They for people who may have been aware, we had a bill in the legislature that was going to restore tribal rights to the Wabanakis. And it's a long story, and there is, I don't even fully understand it, but the main tribes do not have the full array of rights that other tribes across the country have. And so there was a bill to bring the Wabanaki rights up to par with others, and I don't really understand why it was delayed, but it was delayed. And so that if folks have seen that, we've been sharing that on our website or on our Facebook page, that vote was delayed. The bill was put off until next year. So that is an area where you know, I feel it's very clear that, you know, the tribes were the original caretakers of Maine lakes, and they, you know, they deserve to be able to manage those lakes. And it's great to hear, you know, that information you shared about biodiversity on tribal co-managed lands. And so, you know, we'll use that and continue to voice our support for that bill when it comes back. But hopefully other lake associations will do the same. There's some other comments, but I'm looking for if anybody has any other questions. I have more, but I definitely want our audience to get a chance to ask any questions. So please put those in the Q&A.
I think there's one in the chat.
Oh yeah, why don't I read this? I'll just read it right from Tristan over at Lake Stewards of Maine. Organizations, including the EPA, journalists, advocates like, I don't know if I should, let me read this through. Lots of people have argued that unless we change the whiteness of environmental organizations, we aren't going to get as much buy-in from marginalized communities on issues like climate change as we could get. I was wondering if the presenters could speak to the shifting landscape of community composition in the green movement. That's a great question, Tristan.
I can take it first, but Jessica can jump in just to bounce back and forth. I mean, the first thing that just comes to my mind hearing that is that I think that when it comes to the shifting landscape of community composition in the green movement, I don't think the landscape of which communities are involved is shifting as much as hopefully the spotlight is shifting, because communities of color have been in the green movement forever. And again, like the point made about like Indigenous led conservation across the world is important for that reason. But even within the United States, it is Indigenous led conservation. It's also the fact that there have been, I mean, the farm workers, many of whom were Latino, immigrant of origin, fought against pesticides. When you talk about like the BP oil spill, a lot of Asian origin, recent immigrant folks were involved in cleanup. Like every community in this country has been very much there. It's just which names and which faces are the most prominent in the movement. And the example that always comes to my mind is Greta Thunberg standing alongside Ugandan activist Vanessa Nakate, and they cropped the picture so that Vanessa Nakate was out of the picture, and then the picture just became Greta Thunberg. So that's the kind of thing that I think that like the Vanessa Nakates of the world and all those folks in the community in the US are there. It's just like the spotlight that's changing, and it is changing and like continuing that change. Like to echo what Jessica said about like using your voice is important. If you're and this is for white folks, but this like goes across, right? It cuts in any kind of structure where, you know, there's one person or one group that's had more of a limelight than another. Using your voice is important, but like amplifying another's voices equally, if not more important. And so I do think, yeah, it is important that that landscape continue to shift, but the way to do it, like, I don't think is as necessarily difficult as folks think. Like step one is just those who are already there, let them recognize that they're there, because it's already happening very much. And there are great initiatives like the ones that Hispanic Access is doing, but also we just spoke about like some of the incidents around like a lot of Black birders, for example, last year were very vocal about the existence of that community. People think of birding as like something that like older white folks do. I bird, like all these like younger Black people bird, like a lot of people bird. And it's just like what the stakeholder looks like is not what the stakeholder has been presented as.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Sahir. I agree 100% with what Sahir is saying. You know, it's not necessarily that it's a shifting landscape. It's, you know, maybe a shift in narrative. It's, you know, communities of color have been doing this work for generations, you know, and for generations before, you know, white settlers even arrived to the United States. These lands were managed by indigenous groups, and they did a great job at it, you know. So this isn't a new thing. It isn't like communities of color are, you know, becoming involved in this. We've always been involved. It's just that the primary narrative hasn't been that. It's not what you see when you think of, and that's not what these big green organizations represent either. You know, when you're looking at these big green organizations and we see that the makeup of leadership and the makeup of the teams are predominantly white, that's not reflective of the people doing the work. That's reflective of the narrative that we've grown to attribute to this. So I think, you know, to echo what Sahir was saying, it really is about creating that space. It's, you know, looking back into the workforce diversity thing is making sure, yes, that people of color can land these jobs, but more so than that, we want them to land these jobs so that their voice is represented. Because when you have any organization, regardless of what the cause is, regardless of if it's, you know, talking about environmental justice or what we're talking about, when you have 20 voices of the same background, of the same, you know, that are very similar voices of the same experience, you're not going to have a whole lot of perspective. You're not going to have a whole lot of different perspectives that can reach solutions. You know, what we need is diversity of thought primarily, and diversity of thought really comes from diversity of experience. And when everybody looks the same in a room, you don't have that. So really it is about amplifying the voices of communities of color that, again, have been doing this work for generations and will continue to do this work from generations. But it's more so about shifting the narrative, right? Shifting the spotlight more so than shifting the landscape.
So there's, you know, we are, our organization is very similar to lots of organizations and conservation organizations in Maine, in that we struggle to create that diversity even among our board. And one of the things we have a goal of is diversifying our board, getting those other perspectives and other voices on there. And this is always sort of a uncomfortable thing to think about it, because really, you know, how do you approach, so maybe this you could help us, how do you approach someone of color in a different perspective without just saying, hey, we need you on our board? I mean, we need them on our board, but I think a lot of organizations have struggled with how do you make the ask and how do you reach out without sounding like you're just a jerk looking for, you know, not a jerk, but that you're just like, you know, it just has, it's like tokenism. Are you just trying to find like the one person of color to be on your board? So then you can, you know, then you can hold up your board and say, oh, look, we have, you know, we have color. And that's not what that's not that's what it sounds like. That's what it feels like we're doing. But do you have any advice for sort of white boards who are trying to increase that perspective?
I think first off, it's going to be uncomfortable, you know, and leaning into that discomfort is really important because the vulnerability is important in this conversation. You know, to move forward from this, we have to address the systemic inequities and systemic racism that makes up the country. We can't ignore, you know, the generations of genocide of Indigenous groups, and we can't ignore, you know, what happened with Jim Crow and what's continuing to happen to Black people in this country. So, you know, being okay with a little discomfort is really important when it comes to that, and leaning into that a little bit. Also acknowledging that, you know, you don't know everything, and being prepared to, I guess, be wrong is also really important. But I would also, I don't know if I have a specific answer to, you know, how do you ask somebody for this? Because ultimately it comes down to what your intentions are for asking that person. You know, is your intention authentic? And you know, is it going to be a safe space? You know, you don't want to have people of color in these positions for the sake of having, you know, diversity of thought if these places aren't welcoming and comfortable for communities of color or people of color. So I think it really comes down to a restructuring of thought on how to approach this, and just being able to be a little bit vulnerable and be a little bit uncomfortable in those situations. But I guess I'll go back a little bit to what I was saying earlier about making space and creating space. I think a lot of the reason that these organizations continue to be predominantly white is because no one wants to give up their spot, right? No one wants to you know, give their seat to somebody else who hasn't had the opportunity to be there. And it's absolutely uncomfortable and not easy to talk about, but those are all really important conversations that need to be had. And you know, not wanting to tokenize somebody is absolutely what should be the primary intention. You know, we want to diversify what these orgs look like, and we want to diversify our workforce, but it has to be authentic. And if the reason isn't authentic, then it will be tokenization no matter what. And so here, I'll pass it to you for anything else you want to add.
It's like, it's a tricky answer to give because I think that I have a more of a personal thought on this one. I think that, I mean, there's multiple ways to do this kind of work. And like, if a board tomorrow still doesn't look a certain way, or doesn't, that board still has a responsibility, I would say, not just an ability, but also a responsibility to do so many other things in the meanwhile. So I think that if there is a fear at times that something is being driven by, like, I don't want to say that anyone is actually trying to tokenize. What I mean is more like, I think that everyone can find like the first step that they need to take, and like take that step, which I think will feel more natural and better. And I think that sometimes like those things can build towards that moment happening in a way that feels more organic to you as an organization, right? Because it's like, as the organization makes efforts in all these various areas to not look a certain way or not have a certain bias, then I think that does, like, it should happen both ways. Like, it should happen top down, bottom up, all ways, all the time. But like, whatever, like, I think it's better that, I feel like there's more situations where like this happening naturally is blocked than like this is being forced in. And I think that thinking through like, where are we like naturally blocking this from happening is like a good way to start, rather than thinking about like, where can we artificially force this in, if that makes sense. So like, just thinking through like, what's going on in the organization, what's going on in the like membership, what's going on in how we run things that maybe is not creating this organically. And the answer may be what the answer is, like, nobody knows what that answer is going to be, but I feel like just asking that question can lead to a more authentic, because you used the word authentic, which I think was good, a more authentic solution.
Yeah, I guess to round it out a little bit, to allude to what Sahir is saying, is the first step is really identifying our personal and our professional biases, because those exist, you know, they exist for everybody. And a lot of times it's unconscious bias. You don't realize that you have this bias, but that contributes to a lot of the reason why people of color don't get picked for jobs over white people. It's not because the intention is to do that, it's because there is unconscious bias there from you know, the system that we grew up with in this country. So thanks, Sahir, for mentioning that. I think, you know, for like, as a concrete first step, identifying what those biases are and breaking down those biases as an organization, as a hiring manager, as you know, anybody with that sort of power is really important.
Great, thank you so much. A couple more questions have come in. How can we make beaches and lake access points more welcoming to people of color and those communities in Maine? We have many member lake associations, which might be helpful in achieving this goal if we knew what to do to help. And this is something our Environmental Justice Committee is working on. But any thoughts on, did you come across anything about water or lake access specifically in your talk, in your study?
I can answer that quick, and then if Jessica wants to jump in. So the study is like land and water. So it covers human modification at large. So if folks are interested, like we have the origin of like the original piece of work. I do want to credit our partners, conservation science partners, who do a lot of our data work in this process. So conservation science partners put together a whole bunch of different stressors, including energy development, including agriculture, including habitat fragmentation, suburban sprawl, urban infrastructure, transportation, all these different systems, and use that to estimate human modification of a census tract. So that would be the effect on freshwater, it would be the effect on lands, and it would also be the effect on coast. Of course, the ocean is a little more complicated in terms of access, even more so than the coast, but the data takes into account water.
Okay.
Thanks to hear. As far as like some recommendations for how to break down some of these barriers, I think, I guess I'll try to answer pretty quickly, but really it comes down to things like, so if we're talking about a park, what do those park workers and rangers look like? Is there anybody who's bilingual, who speaks multiple languages? Are folks able to communicate with people in charge of the parks? That goes a long way. Do folks look like them? Do the people who work there represent the community that visits those parks? That's another great way. You know, and even looking beyond that, things like accessible signage where folks can read signs in multiple languages, or, you know, even have Braille on signs can go a long way for folks who need that, or being able to provide little things like that really goes a long way. Another example that, you know, might not be specific to the lake, but I love to bring up because it's just like a great example of a barrier that a lot of people would look at and not see as a barrier. But if you go to a local park and you see benches all around and they're all chained to the ground, communities of color are not necessarily going to want to go to that park because, and I'll speak for the Latino community because that's my community. So I have the firsthand knowledge of knowing that my family is going to go to this park and we want to put all the tables together because there's a lot of us and we want to have a lot of food and be together. So if picnic tables are tied down and we don't have that access of moving them, that's immediately going to be a reason that we don't necessarily go to that park. So really being able to look at little things like that and noticing how that can impact a community that, you know, tends to gather with their family in large groups, or so be it. Those little things will go a really long way in just creating a more welcoming environment. You know, and I mentioned earlier, I know it's not quite the same level, but when you go to a national park or a national forest and you see a ranger, you know, who looks like he's dressed like a cop, that's not very welcoming either. So just really being able to break down some of those barriers in that sense. And I know it seems like really small things, but they really, really go a really long way in making people feel welcome there.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've been working, well, we've been talking to our inland fisheries and wildlife about potential for signs and signage, and I just made a note to be thinking about bilingual or trilingual or however many languages are appropriate to the communities we're working in, especially for lakes near our urban areas. So thanks for spurring that for me. One more question, and I think we'll wrap it up. Somebody asked, public transportation in Maine is not great. A lot of our natural lands are only accessible by personal vehicles. Do you have suggestions, or how do we increase access to current public lands? Or should we be shifting more to focus on rewilding our urban areas as a way to provide green space?
I can kick off really quickly. I think the quick answer is both. So I think that more green space in urban areas is absolutely necessary. So I think that should be worked in regardless. But I also think that the transportation thing is definitely not unique to your community in Maine. That's something that as a nation we've all looked at and want to fix and make better. And a lot of that comes with advocating for more public transportation, for the bigger purpose of being able to mitigate some of to being able to mitigate climate change to a certain degree, but also to increase access to public lands. Again, like it's not a unique problem, and unfortunately there's a lot of areas that have that, and that's always going to be a barrier to things. So if you have the capacity and ability, I think a really great way to do that is, something that we do when we host events is make sure that if public transportation isn't an option, how can we provide that for folks? How can we encourage carpooling? How can we break down that barrier a little bit? But I think the bigger answer there is really advocating for some policy change, because things like public transportation, unfortunately, are only going to be changed when it is a big policy action, or there's funding going into that to lessen it a little bit. So yeah, I think the answer is both. I think trying to go after both is really crucial.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to all our audience for tuning in, and thank you both to Jessica and Zahir both for presenting great information and lots of really good things for me, and I hope our audience to take home. And I'm sort of going to walk away from this sort of making space and amplifying others is kind of my takeaway from today. And I will definitely dive into your report, look at your resources, and I hope I speak for all the Lakes communities in Maine and say that we we'll continue to work on this, be uncomfortable, try to have conversations, and thank you both so much for presenting and for the great work you're doing.
Thank you, Susan, and everyone for having us here.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care.
Appreciate it.
Thank you again.